In 2021, Amazon was expanding at a pace few companies had ever attempted, but that speed was beginning to exceed the system's ability to stay in control. The company had doubled its fulfillment network in just a few years, which meant capacity was built for demand that was still accelerating. During the pandemic, online orders surged globally, and this pushed Amazon to hire over 800,000 additional workers to keep up. Warehouses multiplied, logistics networks expanded, and fixed costs increased rapidly, which locked the company into a high expansion structure. At that moment, growth still justified the scale because demand continued rising and masked the pressure building underneath. But by early 2022, demand began to normalize, and this exposed a system that had expanded beyond what was now required. Capacity that once drove growth turned into excess overhead, and this created a mismatch between infrastructure and actual usage. Costs remained high, but revenue growth slowed, which forced the system into a state where efficiency could no longer be ignored. This was the point where expansion stopped being an advantage and became a liability the company had to correct under pressure. Amazon's rise was built on continuous reinvestment, where profits were redirected into expanding infrastructure rather than maximizing short-term margins. From e-commerce origins, the company evolved into a global logistics and cloud infrastructure system, which increased both scale and complexity. Retail operations drove massive volume, while AWS generated high-margin revenue, and this combination fueled aggressive expansion. As demand increased year after year, Amazon built fulfillment centers closer to customers, which reduced delivery times but increased fixed costs. Prime membership reinforced this model because faster delivery expectations required even greater logistical capacity. By the late 2010s, the company was operating a vast network of warehouses, transportation systems, and last-mile delivery infrastructure. This created a system optimized for speed and scale, but one that depended on high utilization to remain efficient. Every new facility added capacity, but it also added cost that needed to be continuously justified by demand. As long as growth continued, the system appeared stable, but it was becoming increasingly dependent on maintaining that expansion pace. At its core, Amazon operated as a multi-layered system where retail, logistics, and cloud infrastructure were tightly interconnected. Retail generated massive order volume, which justified continuous expansion of fulfillment and delivery networks. At the same time, AWS provided high-margin profits, which funded further investment into lower-margin retail operations. This created a structure where growth in one segment supported expansion in another, but it also increased internal dependency. Fulfillment centers, transportation fleets, and last-mile delivery systems had to operate in sync, which required constant coordination at scale. Unlike asset-light platforms, Amazon owned and operated much of its infrastructure, which increased control but also locked in fixed costs. Each new layer of expansion made the system more capable, but also more complex and harder to adjust quickly. Efficiency depended on keeping the entire network highly utilized, because underused capacity translated directly into cost pressure. When demand slowed, this tightly coupled structure had no simple way to scale down without disrupting the entire system. Between 2020 and 2021, Amazon experienced one of the largest demand surges in its history as global lockdowns shifted consumer behavior toward online purchasing. Net sales increased from approximately $280 billion in 2019 to over $470 billion by 2021, and this rapid growth justified aggressive expansion decisions. To support this demand, Amazon nearly doubled its fulfillment network, adding warehouses, sortation centers, and delivery hubs at an unprecedented pace. The company also expanded its workforce to over 1.6 million employees, which significantly increased operating costs tied to labor. This surge in infrastructure allowed Amazon to maintain fast delivery times, which reinforced customer expectations and sustained order volume. At peak demand, the system appeared highly efficient because capacity was fully utilized and revenue growth covered rising costs. However, this efficiency depended entirely on demand remaining elevated, which made the system vulnerable if conditions changed. The expansion locked Amazon into a cost structure designed for peak usage rather than normal demand levels. As long as orders continued at high volume, the system held together, but it was now operating with very little flexibility. As expansion accelerated, the system began accumulating structural pressure because each new facility increased fixed costs that could not be reduced quickly. Warehouses required ongoing staffing, utilities, and maintenance, which meant costs continued even when order volume fluctuated. The network was optimized for speed, but that required excess capacity at all times, which reduced overall efficiency when demand stabilized. Coordination across hundreds of facilities became more complex, and small inefficiencies began to scale across the entire system. At the same time, labor costs increased due to hiring at scale and rising wage pressure, which further tightened operating margins. Transportation expenses also grew as Amazon expanded its delivery network, which added another layer of cost dependency. This created a system where profitability depended on maintaining high throughput across every part of the network. When utilization dropped, the impact was immediate because underused capacity translated directly into financial pressure. These conditions remained manageable during growth, but they set up the system for a sharp adjustment once demand slowed. By early 2022, the surge in online demand began to normalize, and this exposed a system that had been built for conditions that no longer existed. Growth slowed significantly compared to the previous 2 years, but the infrastructure remained sized for peak pandemic demand. Warehouses that once operated at full capacity started running below optimal utilization, which reduced efficiency across the network. Fixed costs did not adjust with demand, and this created immediate pressure on operating margins. The expansion that had enabled rapid growth now became a source of overhead because excess capacity translated directly into financial drag. At the same time, inflation and rising logistics costs increased expenses further, which tightened profitability even more. The system could not contract as quickly as it had expanded, which meant imbalance persisted across operations. What had been a growth engine turned into an overbuilt network that required correction. This was the overshoot moment, where expansion moved ahead of demand and the system lost alignment with its own scale. As the imbalance became clear, Amazon shifted from expansion to correction, and this forced rapid operational changes across the company. The company began slowing warehouse expansion and canceling or delaying new facility projects, which marked a reversal of its previous growth strategy. At the same time, Amazon initiated cost-cutting measures, including reducing corporate workforce by over 18,000 roles across 2022 and 2023. This signaled that the system could no longer sustain its previous cost structure under normalized demand conditions. Retail operations reported losses in certain quarters, which highlighted how sensitive profitability was to utilization levels. The company also focused on improving efficiency within existing facilities, which aimed to increase output without further expansion. Logistics networks were re-optimized to reduce excess capacity, but this required time because infrastructure could not be adjusted instantly. Despite strong overall revenue, Operating income came under pressure, which forced a shift toward profitability rather than pure growth. This response phase showed that correcting an overbuilt system required reducing scale and restoring alignment between capacity and demand. Amazon's expansion showed that scaling infrastructure ahead of demand can accelerate growth, but it also increases the risk of overshooting. Owning logistics and fulfillment systems provided speed and control, but it locked the company into a cost structure that required constant utilization. During periods of rising demand, this structure created efficiency, but when demand stabilized, it exposed excess capacity immediately. The system was not failing due to lack of revenue, but due to misalignment between scale and actual usage. This highlighted a core trade-off between expansion and control, where increasing one reduces flexibility in the other. Unlike asset-light platforms, Amazon could not adjust quickly because its infrastructure required time and cost to reconfigure. The correction phase demonstrated that growth systems must eventually optimize for efficiency to remain sustainable. Amazon did not collapse, but it was forced to rebalance a system that had expanded beyond its operational equilibrium. This case shows that even the most advanced growth engines can lose control when expansion outpaces the ability to adjust.